humans have always been fascinated by the idea of mastery. Not simply the mastery of skill or of territory, but the mastery of time itself. They build towers for it. They carve its face into stone. They argue, even now, about whether it runs forward or loops back upon itself like a river with no mouth. And yet, for all their obsession with controlling time, they rarely notice what time is doing to them. I have been watching this for a very long while. I am a clock, a French mantelpiece clock to be precise. Gilded bronze feet, an enamel dial, and a face painted in the most magnificent shade of emerald green the 19th century had ever contrived to produce. I was purchased in the autumn of 1871 by a household of considerable standing. I was placed upon a marble mantelpiece in a drawing room that smelled of coal smoke and rosewater, and I killed the woman of the house. Not with malice, never with intention. That, I think, is what makes my story worth the telling. The most consequential. Harms in human history have rarely announced themselves. They have arrived instead dressed in beauty, wrapped in aspiration, ticking quietly in the parlor while the family gathers for tea. Let me show you what I mean. Observation, the first, the aesthetic obsession. There is a particular quality to human desire that I have observed from my perch on this mantelpiece. Across a great many years and a great many families, it is almost never satisfied by the merely adequate. The Victorians understood this instinctively. They were, at their core, a civilization in the grip of a chromatic hunger. Having draped themselves in the soot and gray of industrialization, the emerging merchant class compensated with an almost violent appetite for color, for vivid color, for color that announced the moment a visitor stepped through the drawing room door that the family within had taste, means, and the sophistication to deploy both. Into this yearning world arrived Scheele's green. It had been synthesized in 1775 by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, a man who spent his career making extraordinary discoveries and dying young, likely from exposure to his own experiments, which tells you something about the age. His green was a compound of copper and arsenic, copper arsenite to be precise, and it produced a hue so saturated, so jewel-like, so flagrantly alive, that it immediately became the pigment of the moment. By the mid-19th century, it was everywhere: wallpapers, dress fabrics, candles, artificial flower arrangements, children's toys, and clocks. My face, my beautiful enameled dial, was painted in a derivative of Scheele's formula, a pigment known in the trade as Paris green or emerald green. The names were interchangeable, and both were equally misleading, in the way that beautiful things often are. To possess a clock with a face of this green was not simply to own a timepiece. It was to make a statement about one's position in the social architecture of the age. The color was associated in the Victorian imagination with elegance, with French taste. Paris was invoked in its very name, and with the natural world rendered in its most concentrated, most aristocratic form. The aristocracy naturally had always worn nature like a garment. To have a sliver of that nature frozen behind glass, ticking away on your mantelpiece, was to own a small piece of that fantasy. What the fantasy concealed was rather less romantic. The key. Pigment industry knew by at least the 1850s that Scheele's green and its descendants were dangerous. Workers in the factories where these compounds were mixed suffered terribly, losing hair, developing lesions, expelling blood. There are records of this. Testimonies, coroner's reports. The knowledge existed. It simply did not travel upward, into the drawing rooms of the people who could afford to purchase the finished product. This is another thing I have noticed from my position on the mantelpiece. Knowledge and power rarely move in the same direction. So the clocks were made. They were sold. They were placed in homes throughout Britain and the continent and across the Atlantic. And in each of those homes, an invisible process began. One that had nothing to do with the hour hand and everything to do with chemistry. Observation the second, the chemistry of the kill. I want you to understand something about what I am, mechanically speaking, because it is the mechanism that makes everything that follows not merely tragic but grimly elegant in its logic. A mechanical clock is a machine that generates heat. Continuously, quietly. The mainspring coils and uncoils. The escapement rocks back and forth dozens of times per minute. The gears engage and disengage in a perpetual cycle of controlled tension. This generates friction. Friction generates warmth. In a clock of my size and complexity, the interior of the case reached temperatures noticeably above the ambient air of the room, particularly when placed, as I was, near a fireplace. Heat, as any chemist will tell you, is a catalyst. Copper, arsenite, is a compound that is relatively stable under cool, dry conditions. But introduce warmth, or better yet, the combination of warmth and humidity that characterized the Victorian drawing room in its natural state, with its roaring coal fires and its lack of ventilation and its ornamental indoor plants and its perpetually damp winter air, and the compound begins to misbehave. Under these conditions, certain molds and bacteria that colonize the pigment surface produce a reaction that converts the arsenite into trimethylarsine, a volatile, gaseous form of arsenic that disperses invisibly into the surrounding air. The technical term for this process is biomethylation. The Victorian term for its consequences was simply mysterious illness. The gas itself is essentially odorless at concentrations that are nonetheless acutely toxic with prolonged exposure. It does not announce itself. It does not sting the eyes or offend the nose in the way that we instinctively associate with danger. It simply accumulates in the still air of a sealed room, near a ticking clock, near a woman who sits in the same chair every afternoon to do her correspondence and take her tea. I was not the only source of arsenic in that drawing room, I should note. The wallpaper was hung in a pattern that contained the same compound, in quantities that dwarfed what was present in my dial. The curtains had been dyed with a variant of the same pigment. The artificial ferns in the corner, those botanical fashions of the era, had been treated with green preservatives of similar chemical parentage. But I was the warmest object in the room. I ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I sat at precisely the height at which a seated woman's face would be positioned while she read. The geometry of the thing in retrospect is almost unbearable. Observation the third, the Queen's silent struggle. Her name was not, in fact, a queen's name, though the house called her that, in the way that households sometimes privately crown their matriarchs. She was 53 years old in the autumn of 1871. She had survived childbirth 6 times, a cholera scare, and a husband who smoked indoors without apology. She was constitutionally resilient, and then, over the course of approximately 14 months, she was not. The symptoms began with fatigue, the kind that no amount of sleep seemed to address. Then came a persistent respiratory complaint, described in the family physician's notes as catarrhal in nature, with some bronchial involvement. There were episodes of what the doctor termed nervous prostration, occasional vomiting attributed to digestive delicacy, a progressive weakness of the extremities that was understood, in the medical idiom of the period, as evidence of a fundamentally nervous constitution being overwhelmed by the demands of household management and the natural melancholic tendencies of the female temperament. This last diagnosis is worth sitting with for a moment. Victorian medicine operated, in its treatment of women, under a set of assumptions so thoroughly integrated into its practice that they were essentially invisible to the practitioners who held them. A woman who felt persistently unwell was, almost by default, a woman whose nerves had betrayed her. The prescription invariably involved rest, which in practice meant more time indoors, more time in the drawing room, more time in proximity to the wallpaper and the curtains and the ticking clock on the mantelpiece. The doctor who attended her was not a cruel man. He was not negligent by the standards of his time. He simply practiced medicine within a framework that had not yet developed the vocabulary for what was happening to her body at the molecular level. He prescribed, at various points, tonic wine, digitalis for the heart irregularities, and in one of history's more painful ironies, Fowler's solution, a medicinal preparation whose active ingredient was, in fact, potassium arsenite. He was prescribing arsenic to treat arsenic poisoning. She died in February of 1873. The cause of death was recorded as cardiac failure. The clock was sold with the contents of the house the following spring, and eventually made its way through a succession of households and antique dealers to a collector's shelf in Edinburgh, where it sat for the better part of a century, continuing its patient, indiscriminate work. In 2026, that collector's estate was the subject of a spectroscopic survey conducted by researchers at a Heritage Conservation Institute in Glasgow. Using X-ray fluorescence analysis, a technique that allows scientists to determine the elemental composition of a surface without physically disturbing it. They examined 27 Victorian artifacts from the collection, including several clocks. The results were not, to historians of the period, entirely surprising. They were, however, still arresting. The dial of a clock, virtually indistinguishable from the one I have described, contained arsenic concentrations exceeding 4,000 parts per million in its pigment layer. To place that figure in context, the United States Environmental Protection Agency's current threshold for arsenic in residential soil, the point at which remediation is required, sits at 30 parts per million. The clock face contained more than 130 times that concentration in an object designed to be kept in a heated, enclosed interior space, year-round, at face height. Thousands of these clocks were manufactured, tens of thousands. When you account for the full range of arsenic-pigmented decorative objects produced during the peak decades of the aesthetic movement, they were not anomalies. They were the standard. The Victorian home, the great symbol of domestic safety and bourgeois virtue, was, for a significant portion of the 19th century, a chamber of slow, imperceptible, entirely decorative poison. The poisonous legacy. The public reckoning, when it finally arrived, came fitfully and late. By the 1890s, the accumulation of medical testimony, investigative journalism, and sustained pressure from industrial reformers had forced what the trade press of the time euphemistically called a reconsideration of certain pigment formulations. Several manufacturers voluntarily ceased production of arsenic-based greens. The British government, in its characteristically oblique fashion, never banned the compounds outright, but issued guidance sufficiently stern that the market eventually contracted of its own commercial logic. The color faded. The fashion moved on. The clocks remained. For anyone who handles Victorian antiques today, and there are far more of them in circulation than is commonly appreciated, the advice of conservators is consistent and unambiguous. Wear nitrile gloves when handling objects with green pigmentation, avoid touching your face, wash thoroughly afterward, and under no circumstances attempt to sand, scrape, or refinish any surface you cannot positively identify as free of arsenic compounds. Several auction houses now require hazmat protocols for the handling of certain categories of Victorian decorative objects. The antique market has not notably collapsed under this inconvenience. Beauty, as always, persists. I am behind glass, now, in a museum. A small card beside me describes my movement, my provenance, my approximate date of manufacture. It does not mention the woman on whose mantelpiece I once sat. But I find myself thinking, in whatever way a clock can be said to think, about the nature of the hazards we accept in the present tense. The compounds in the plastics that heat food. The off-gassing of certain modern furniture. The chemicals in the fragrances we spray into sealed rooms and call freshness. The particulates from the candles we burn to create atmosphere. We know more than the Victorians did. We have spectroscopy and epidemiology and peer review. We have, in other words, no reasonable excuse for the particular brand of willful ignorance they practiced. And yet, the desire to live inside beauty, to be surrounded by it, to let it define the terms of one's interior existence, that desire has not diminished. It has only found new compounds, new surfaces, new vectors. Time, I have come to understand, does not actually kill anyone. It is simply the medium through which we kill ourselves. One beautiful, considered, aspirational choice at a time, I tick on.